morning, everybody. I'm Helen Waite from the Museum of Cannock Chase. I'm a freelancer who specialises in volunteering and also run a volunteer organisation. So we're here today. We want to identify barriers that prevent access to art jobs. That might sound like I'm teaching you how to suck eggs. You may think that you already know what those barriers are, and I'd like us to just think outside of the box a little bit and try and think about the types of people that we haven't met yet, but we do want to bring into our museum environments. We're going to look and explore strategies to support entry to careers for people that wouldn't ordinarily have access to the museums. And I want to encourage you to become active advocates for change. So I do want to be quite hands-on. I do want to ask you a question initially, and we're going to be using the chat function. That question is, what inspired your interest in heritage, in museums, in the arts? What got you really passionate about museums? Well, I tell you a little bit about myself. So why am I qualified to speak on this? You might think, as a white cis woman, that breaking barriers, I don't really have any. However, my background is working class. I didn't have the option of going to university the first time. Nobody in my family had ever considered university. And so it just wasn't an option. We had to work. Thank you for putting some comments in the chat. Can we keep those coming, please, while I'm talking, so that we can refer back to them in a moment? So I had no option of higher education. I had to go to work. However, after 15 gap years, I got divorced and had a small child. I was a lone parent, single mom, didn't want a 17-year-old in a nursery bringing my kid up, but also knew that I had to generate some income for our family. So I looked at jobs that I might want to do instead of jobs that I'd always been forced into, and started looking at the type of job descriptions, the kind of characteristics that they wanted for jobs in museums, libraries, anything like that, where I thought, avoid people and just work with collections. I just got one little shadow cackle there. Sorry. So all of the jobs that I was looking at wanted a degree, and I had to go and find ways of getting a degree with just GCSEs. So that was my initial barrier, that yes, I'd achieved basic GCSEs, but I was in an inner city school in Birmingham. You know, they weren't very highly regarded, and they were 17 years old. So I had to go and do what they call an access to higher education diploma. And I was really lucky that there is a really supportive college nearby that is a residential college that take all of the daily dramas away from you. So they cook for you. If you don't have children, you can live there. That's called Faircroft College of Adult Education, if anybody is interested or wants to signpost their young people there. It's a really inclusive environment where you can concentrate on your studies. That got me into the University of Birmingham, and I was then able to apply for different scholarships and bursaries. This was a completely new environment for me. Never had I ever considered being in a red brick university, and I'm still surprised that they let me in. I did get some scholarships. I managed to get a Lloyds Bank scholarship, which meant that Lloyds Bank would take a punt on me. They would pay for me to do internships at Lloyds Bank during the summer months. Unfortunately, my past record meant that I was then red carded and I wasn't able to do the placements in the banks. But we managed to negotiate, and they said that they would continue to fund me if I found a job that I could do. So I went to every single institution on campus. I went to the Lapworth Museum of Geology. I went to Research and Cultural Collections. I went to the Cadbury Research Library. I went to the Institute of Textual Scholarship and Electronic Editing, which is ITSE, mouthful. And that got me into really understanding different types of arts venues, of heritage venues, of museums, and being able to access so many different types of collections as well and respond to those differently, but within the microcosm of a university. So everybody's understanding of those collections was a certain type of tier of intelligence. And what I wanted to do was bring those collections to a different kind of audience, because I knew that as a single mom, I wanted to take my kid and I wanted him to see these fabulous collections. But all the wording was so difficult to understand that actually there was a real access issue. There was a real barrier to understanding. Not only was it difficult for people who hadn't been on a red brick campus before to walk around and feel as if they were welcome there, and then when they got there, it was so posh. And you have to buy the Costa at £8, and you have to do these, there's all these things that are barriers to our collections, whether we consider them barriers or not. So during my time at the University of Birmingham, I've mentioned all the different places that I volunteered as an intern, with Lloyds Bank paying for me to do it. That would not have been possible had I not had those scholarships. I would have had to work to feed my kid. But I had the luxury, I had the privilege of being sponsored by Lloyds Bank, which meant that gave me that freedom to really explore and get the experience that we're all asking early careers museum entrants to have. The collections that I concentrated on during that time were all very different. So I did a virtual manuscript room, making some of the manuscripts available online. Again, an access thing. We digitized them so that anybody in the world can get their hands on the original manuscripts. Research and Cultural Collections, I concentrated on decolonising the collection, and also activism projects around the 60s movement for civil rights. At the Lapworth, I worked on the diary entries of a female geologist who was actually banned from the academy because she was female. So she used to go and explore in her Victorian dress, get all the research, write about the Dolomites, come home, and then she would have to give it to Professor Lapworth to actually publish her findings. We're not talking that long ago. For the Cadbury Research Library, I worked on interfaith communications and the Birmingham Quran, as it is now known. So one of the oldest fragments of Quran was actually discovered, found, recognised for what it was essentially during my time at ITSE. And we were very, very lucky to then take it around the world. We went to Dubai, Sharjah, Abu Dhabi, with the fragment, and thought about ways of getting people, different types of people, to engage with that Quran. And we did it through art, we did it through calligraphy and understanding and drawing to get young people involved. So the theme there is predominantly, I've always been that the voice of the person who can't access your collection, finding a way to try and engage people using your collection as the tool, and providing access guides, creating different ways and thinking about things a bit differently. I also do that because I have special educational needs that were identified while I was at university. I am neurodiverse, I am quite spicy and do think about things in different ways. And I also have a son who is now 14, going on 15, and also has differing special educational needs. So I have a real ability to tune into different types of things that may become a barrier. Looking at some of your comments, everybody's really interested in different things. So We've got art, art teachers visiting castles, being able to get involved in culture, having the support of your parents to take you to those sort of spaces, doing printing workshops, getting involved, all of the things that we know that we're losing a lot of funding for. And with the cost of living crisis, can parents afford to take their children and ignite and inspire and create those lovely memories around heritage, the arts and museums? So I'm going to talk about the types of barriers now. A barrier is an obstacle that keeps things apart. So we hear a lot of reports about barriers and not being able to access things, inclusivity, diversity, all these words. Essentially, it's the blocking point. And what we're talking about is the blocking point between the person and the museum. And what we want to do by the end of this workshop is stop that blocking point and create a pathway instead. So let's find out what the blocking points are. Educationally, I've spoken a lot about my own experience, access to the relevant degrees, access to degrees in general, special educational needs, not getting diagnosed for those needs, not being able to articulate those needs for fear of judgment. Identification of neurodiversity is growing. How are we as a workspace and a workplace responding to those needs? How are we opening up those conversations? CPD, so educationally, we should be looking at trying to develop our people, trying to create time and space and funding so that our people can become the best asset that we can get. Working hours and medication needs are also educational barriers, because if you need to take your medication at a certain time, you will struggle to then be able to function with your diversity. Socioeconomic barriers are probably the closest to my heart, so I will speak on those quite a bit. That is the financial constraints. So I've told you about my absolute privilege of being sponsored by Lloyds Bank. That is the only reason I'm sitting here today. And the reality is most people who try and access the arts, museums, heritage will be forced into making really difficult choices about how to spend their time and gain experience. The cost of higher education in 2023-24 is £62,720. I was shocked by that. And I've paid the full rate, I paid the £9,000 or whatever it was at the time. If you now want to do a basic 3 years and then a master's, £62,720 is what you're going to owe. The cost of travelling to locations, so that's just, getting to your volunteering job. A car on average, if you're commuting, is £218 a month. And rail is £89.60 a month. So if we're asking people to do unpaid internships, they have an outlay of either £218 if they're coming in the car, and then £90 on trains and buses, without any of the other things that you have to have when you're out at work. Your lunch, for example, your coffee. Cost of childcare is a massive, massive barrier to trying to get a diverse workforce. So if we would like, for example, to get these women who have, like me, had an epiphany during maternity leave or shortly after, and they've got a child under the age of 5, to do a part-time job, you're going to be asking them to pay out £148.63 on average per kid per week. That's only a term time place, which means 38 to 42 weeks of the year. So that person has to have childcare, has to pay for their childcare, but then also during holiday times has to look after their kid. If you were to pay for a full-time place at nursery or, under five care, it's 300 quid a week. So that's over £1,000 before they've even started. That's just to be able to volunteer or intern with you, or as an early career access with a low entry level salary. So with the unpaid internships, they can't work somewhere else, or they do work somewhere else, but then they're working two jobs, potentially studying at the same time. What that's adding up to is burnout. Low entry level salaries. I'm going to give you an example because I went online. My local museum, not Cannock Chase, but a museum local to where I live, is currently advertising for an educator role. That educator role is 12.75 hours, term time only. So that's 472 quid a month. If we were to say that that was a young person who no longer lives at home, they potentially living in a room, one room in a house share was the cheapest way I could do it. That's 600 quid a month. That means that that person's working for 3 days a week and they're taking home £32 after they've paid for a roof over their head. That person was also asked within the job description to have an overarching understanding of the whole curriculum, to have experience of working with children, an educational background, and a full understanding of safeguarding. Are we asking too much for too little? And what do we do about it? One of the other financial constraints is obviously your background, and that can affect networking. So many a time have I walked into a space and gone, whoa, not for me. I don't belong here. It also meant that I couldn't go to gallery openings. Not only did I not have the childcare, but I couldn't afford to get there. I couldn't go and mingle and network and make friends within the industry who would then become my peers. And your geographical location. Again, if you live further away from where the majority of museums are, to be able to come and volunteer or get the experience that you need to get a low entry level job, you're going to be spending more money to get there. Morris Davis has written loads. It's called The Tomorrow People, and he writes on unpaid internships and low entry level salaries within our industry. You can find that on the Museum Association, or I think Liv's going to do a lovely digital tote bag for you. So I'll try and include it in there so you can read some more of Morris's stuff. Accessibility, I touched on at the start. There are lots of different reasons why we cannot, and our young people cannot access careers in museum industry. But the obvious one is physical accessibility. Some of us are limited. Physically, we should be doing the right thing. We should be having the conversations and making our spaces accessible. That is not a barrier that in this day and age we should have to try and overcome. But it remains. And it is prevalent, and there are reasons why people can't get into museums because they can't access it physically. Another point there is toilet use and access for people to have a radar key without explanation. So some people have an urgency to use the toilet, and we should not be questioning that. There should be, within the volunteer space, access to the radar key, the disabled toilet, and no questions asked policy. And unfortunately, I do a lot of research with young people, and at the moment, we're failing on that one. We really shouldn't be. Digital accessibility. So one of the things that my young people recently have come up with is that they can't do the online forms. And we think of, the Silver Surfers not being capable of doing the digital. But actually, if you have special educational needs and you've always had an EHCP with a TA, a teaching assistant, to help you manage those things, you've managed to get through your mainstream education with support. And now, as a young adult, that support's gone. How is that young person going to access an online form, an online application? And should we have a hybrid way of doing that so that we can include everybody. We could also consider taking that a step further and having somebody who is willing to sit and support that person in filling out the forms if they show an interest. There is a lack of inclusive practice. There is a lack of reasonable adjustments. And your job, our job, is to create a safe space where those reasonable adjustments can be discussed, communicated, and then we can take it to our tables and have that implemented as strategy and framework and policy. Some of the other accessibility needs that my young people came up with were busy working environments, so having breakout spaces, having adjustable lighting and changeable lighting dependent on who's there, and even just a basic understanding of sign language, so that and lip reading, so that we can be as clear in our communication as possible for as many people as possible. Cultural barriers. So, I mean, better people have spoken than I on lack of representation. And again, I'm going to be adding some of these writers, some papers, some resources for you into the digital tote bag about cultural barriers, but some of them that are specific to me and certainly the people that I work with. There is a lack of representation in museums for people who have encountered poverty and who come from low socio-economic backgrounds. There are language barriers. I know when I first started, I tried everything. I tried changing my accent. I'm now a proud working class Brummie. But I know that there are certainly jobs in fine art establishments that discounted me, not because of my experience or my ability, but because of the way that I looked and acted and the people that they perceived as their visitors not wanting that in their space. And also culturally, the care responsibility. So 66% of caregivers are female. On average, we look after our children 45 hours a week. And then when they're older, we end up looking after our parents. On average, national average is 20 hours a week. So those care responsibilities are a cultural barrier that limit our ability. And geographic. So Nesta have done a brilliant report on museums. They are the AIM accredited museums. There's 1,304 of them. I'll link the Nesta map so that you can all have a look. But there are travel restrictions, proximity to venues. Nesta say that there tend to be more museums in areas with higher levels of population. So we then look at the barrier between rural opportunities and urban opportunities. The average commute to work is 27 minutes in the UK. We know that certain people are travelling on bus and rail for over 3 hours a day to do unpaid internships or volunteering opportunities or very low level entry career salary jobs. So just drop my notes, but I want you to go back into the chat and I want you to no, don't. I want you to go into a breakout room. I want you to speak up. I want you to know that this is your opportunity to have a seat at the table. And the things that I would like you to discuss are what specific barriers have you observed or experienced in accessing museums? And then how do these barriers affect the diversity and inclusivity of the museum workforce? I'm going to whack that in the chat for you. Copy that, because I don't think the chat comes through to the breakout rooms, but we'll see. And you're going to have a few minutes to go, and I will be asking people to speak when you get back into the room. Okay, so you've broken out, you've had a chat. Can we feedback? Can somebody from each group Give us some ideas. What barriers have you observed or experienced yourself in accessing a career in museums?
Should we go through the room? Should we do room one? Although I don't know if you know who your groups were.
Thanks, Jodie. That's helpful. If you want to put it in the chat instead, put it in the chat.
I'm happy to jump in. We were in room three. We were talking about, we just really agreed with all of the different barriers you'd mentioned, Helen. We felt the biggest constraint often that we'd experienced was sometimes financial on both sides, because when our organisations are so financially strapped, the additional things that we want to do to make volunteering accessible get harder and harder as teams are smaller, um and so we felt, you know, whilst and also managing the expectations of people, both on both sides could be a misalignment, that we are kind of constantly striving to reconnect so that people in wider teams have a good understanding of what volunteering means to people and what they can expect. Because if they don't expect what volunteers are able to offer, then you're not set up to succeed. But I don't know if anyone else who's in the room wants to jump in as well and remind me of all the things I've forgotten.
We also spoke about the kind of vast amount of information you're expected to know as volunteer, and also within a kind of job role. So different approaches within different museums, and expecting to know, you know, more interpretive information and trying to convey that, but also different approaches which are more kind of informal and about how we think and feel about exhibitions um, and spaces. So kind of navigating the amount of information you're expected to know, and also how to communicate that, can be quite a lot when you're starting up, volunteering or a career.
Brilliant. So we had a really good point as well. Cultural literacy, not knowing how to interact with museums and heritage spaces, but also not knowing what roles exist within museums. And that takes us into how we make barriers into pathways. So at the start, I was talking about the fact that we've got people, the barrier or the blocker or the obstacle, and then the museum. And what we want to do now is take the people, create a pathway to the museum. So what we've done over at Cannock is, as part of AIM kin funding, which is Know Your Neighbourhood funding that a lot of you will have had in one guise or another, we've used the Connected Communities Fund to create volunteer opportunities for young people trying to access careers in museums. Those young people are 16 to 34, so quite a wide range, 16 to 34. We looked at how do we create volunteers and early year career professionals from a starting point of very little education, lots of additional needs, really tried to target people that wouldn't have the opportunity for employment in another capacity. So we sought out partners. And in working in collaboration with partners, we were able to target a demographic of people that have been quite hopeless, not inspired, not accessing not going out, essentially, very lonely, not a high rate of well-being or self-worth or self-confidence. And I felt that was the perfect target, to try and create a pathway that would take them from the point that they are at the baseline there, and create a safe space where we could nurture and incubate the possibility of them becoming volunteers, which in the long term, once you've got volunteer experience, means that you're more likely to get a career in museums, heritage and the arts. So our partnerships were Support Staffordshire, which is a volunteer organisation in our locality, and the Staffordshire College, the local college. Support Staffordshire run a programme. It's not dissimilar to in the 80s and 90s with New Deal, where people who have been on income support or job seekers allowance or universal credit, as now is, but unable to find work, are put into almost a job club type scenario. So they go along to New Start for You. They are able to support these people weekly in CV building, in confidence building, in support with their benefits and how to spend money wisely, and all of these lovely sort of wraparound care things. But what was evident for me when I went to meet these young people was that there's very little hope, very little aspiration, and actually the job club had become just the one place that they visited that week. It was a safe haven where they could go and just be and have a hot cup of tea when maybe home wasn't very warm, and they'd go, but actually they'd come to be with other people rather than to aim towards creating a job for themselves. So we went in. It was difficult to begin with to earn the trust that actually the museum doesn't have an agenda here. We have a pot of money which has been created to support people's well-being, to improve their loneliness, and to engage a different type of audience with our collection. And we spent weeks going to this hub space and meeting at the job club, doing different activities, creating a pathway. So we did clay. So we looked at different objects and then they created their favourite one in clay, or we did bead making, we played Uno. We then invited them to the museum, and there were people who were able to come along with them, that they were recognised and supported that way. In the museum, Diane created a fabulous gallery bingo, so they were able to walk around the gallery spaces that they'd never been in before, and actually had never been in a similar situation before. But in doing something really simple where it was pictorial, so there's a picture bingo, you see the object on the photograph and then you find it in the collection, that created the ability to walk around, to familiarise themselves with the space, with the collection, and one another. And we did that I'm still doing that. We've done that now for over 16 weeks. And we are only just at the point at which we are looking at now onboarding a few of those young people as actual volunteer roles with volunteer descriptions, but we're working those volunteer descriptions out collaboratively. So we're looking at the needs of the people, we're looking at what they wish to do as a career and what the holes are. So it's incredibly holistic and has taken time. One of the things that you said was we are limited, we have limited funds. This was project funding that allowed this. But what we're trying to do through Know Your Neighbourhood and feeding that back to DCMS is show that not everybody is ready for a full-time volunteer job, and that actually we do need to create these pathway initiatives to be able to encourage people to break down those barriers. One of the other things that we did was made sure that the right people were in the room. So the volunteer coordinator has now been doing a mentoring course. That's a level 3 accredited course, which means that they are best placed to nurture this next type of person into the museum. I've just had a message from Liv, which was very distracting, saying that I've got 10 minutes left. So what I want to ask you in the chat are, what are the strategies that you would put in place to create these pathways in your institution, in your museum, in your environment? Would anybody like to speak on it?
Hi. Yeah, I'm happy to say what we've been doing in Manchester. We've been working with, so we've got a post that is embedded in the local GP practice.
Brilliant.
So it's a health and wellbeing coach post. So they started earlier this year. They are kind of the GPs are kind of referring people who don't probably need a clinical intervention, but they do need to connect with people. They're socially isolated, high anxiety, lots of different kind of things that actually they need people and connections. So that's been working really well, and that then they are signposted because the post holder works for both the museum and he's employed by the NHS, but he works half and half with us and the GP practice. So it's been amazing, because then you see people come through and they kind of interact with our programs in a kind of gradual, slow way, with sort of held by him. He kind of holds those relationships, and then yeah, it's been a really good partnership. I think the other partners we work with have also worked well, like Sure Start, and kind of working with the adults, you know. So I think for me, partnerships is the key, like you've identified.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sure Start, family centres, family hubs, all of the places that families go as a well-being space. And if we create those safe spaces, we know that busy hands equal open mouths, and that will support itself. You'll get peer-to-peer support as well. Is it a social prescriber that you've got up in Manchester?
So he sits in the social prescribing team, but his job role is actually called a coach, health and wellbeing coach, which is a relatively new role within GPs, I think, at the moment. I'm not sure.
That's a really good heads up for people who are looking to start creating these collaborations. Finding grassroots organisations, finding your VCSE organisations, that's your voluntary and your social enterprises, your social prescribers, local authority, local unemployment coordinators. If you can reach out, then you can create opportunities with a really good framework that will make new types of volunteers, and hopefully create a better museum for having everybody's viewpoints. So we've got some people putting stuff in the chat that's really helpful, because that informs decision making. Ignite and inspire parents to be the gateway for under 16 young volunteers through family volunteering. Pippa, that one's brilliant. So this idea that you haven't got to pay for a day out, you can come as a family and you can volunteer at the same time and get into the collections. That's absolutely perfect. So now we've only got a few minutes left. I would like to call you to action, and I would like you to hold yourselves accountable by creating one action that you're going to take away from today. So within your role, within your means, what can you do to try and create access to art jobs? What strategies can you put in place to support entry for careers and volunteering? How are you going to advocate for change? Can anyone speak on it?
I could just add, Helen, that what we're doing now, what I'm doing now is two things. I've part of our access and inclusion working group, so that we meet quarterly to try and pull together new ideas and see what can be implemented across all of our sites. And that's aimed primarily at visitors, but also benefit, it's also the forum we have for expanding accessibility for staff and volunteers. And again, just to second what you said about partnerships, we've got a really strong partnership now with a local college who works with students who have learning disabilities and differing educational needs. And from out of that, we've had a couple of really successful placements, and those students have gone on, some of them, to become long-term volunteers. And whilst I'm not aware of anyone who it's led to employment for them, it has led to really improved things like confidence using transport, and that can be like a first step. So sometimes try not to be disheartened if you haven't got, you think, oh, well, we can't do this, because sometimes even little steps are good steps.
Absolutely, absolutely. And some of the things that we do generate is, even just aspiration. If you take somebody who thinks that they are destined to spend the rest of their life, who is between the ages of 16 and 34 in our case, and you turn around their thinking that actually I can have a purpose, I can go out and leave the house and do something. It might not be every day to begin with, it might be 3 hours a day to begin with, but just that aspiration will increase their social connections, encourage pride in place, have improved confidence, reduce loneliness, and improve their well-being ultimately. So I just wanted to end with a couple of quotes on things that people have said to me that we could take away and maybe implement in our jobs. All I needed were the session plans in advance, so I don't have a panic attack. I've been diagnosed with depression because of all the knockbacks. Most jobs don't even give me a reason, so how can I do better? I'm really good at my work, everybody says so, but my new medication means I can't wake up early enough to start at 9 a.m. I can't do the application and I can't explain why, because they'll think that that means I can't do the job. I can remember facts and I love history and talking to people. I just mix up my words on the form. So I wanted to leave you with those personal testimonies so that you can take it and act on it, become advocates for change, and change one thing. I would like you to put it in the chat. Change one thing in what you're doing to make it easier for somebody to come in and access the museums. And then I'm going to leave you with the knowledge that Liv is creating a digital tote bag for the conference. And so all of the resources that I've spoken about will be on there, as well as all the other speakers. I'm happy for you to reach out to me if you want to talk about anything, or indeed I am interested in establishing a best practice forum. I know there are lots, there are a few, there are different types of forums. If you're interested in creating a best practice forum for collaborations, then just get in touch.